On June 25th in 1675, a delegation of colonial diplomats traveling to Mount Hope, Rhode Island, attempting to negotiate with the Grand Sachem of the Wampanoag Confederacy, Metacomet, was stopped in its tracks by a grisly sight. Before them were, quote, the bodies of divers Englishmen on the ground, weltering in their own blood, having been newly murdered by the Indians. In a terrible revelation, the group decided that they could not proceed further, as, quote, a peace now could not honorably be concluded after such barbarous outrages. In typical fashion, preacher Increase Mather offered a didactic message to the hitherto scrupulous Puritan colonists.
Since the enemy did shed the blood of some of ours who never did them the least wrong, no man can now doubt the justness of our cause.
The resentments which had festered in the heart of the wilderness continent came to bear their poisonous fruit. For the next 3 years, New England would be engulfed in a nightmare of carnage and mayhem. It is not entirely clear just exactly how or why the war started when it did, writes historian Jill Lepore, but from the firing of the first shots, both sides pursued it with viciousness and almost without mercy. As if this catastrophe caused a great cosmic disturbance, imprinting itself onto its very fabric and reverberating through time. In the weeks leading up to the war, before any fighting had even begun, both colonists and Native Americans were haunted by supernatural visions and dire omens. In Boston and Plymouth, residents heard the sounds of gunshots and bullets whistling through the air, field drums, and the disembodied sounds of marching through the woods. Who was it, then, that fired the first shot? Was it the Englishman in Swansea, or a Wampanoag, as the powwows feared, who had prophesied that to ensure victory, they had to wait for the English to fire first? Indeed, the chronicling of this chapter of history challenges our grasp of linear time, a legacy of bloodshed which some historians claim never truly ended. Despite the viciousness of King Philip's War, there were many people on both sides who were ambivalent towards it. Having kept peace for 50 years, both sides were socially intertwined. Many colonists expressed their disapproval, and it was said that the Wampanoags, quote, were in a kind of maze, not knowing what to do. It makes what would unfold all the more tragic, and leads us to wonder how, nonetheless, this brutal conflict would ensue. In the confusion of the time, people looked to the supernatural for answers. Everything had to be contextualized within notions of the cosmic order to try to preserve their sense of meaning and avoid falling into despair. It is this phenomenon that will be the driving focus of our investigation into what would become, per capita, America's bloodiest conflict, embroiling almost all of New England. To call this conflict a war in the traditional sense is misleading. What we're dealing with here is more like a series of atrocities. From its outset, both colonists and Native Americans were deeply entrenched in mystical attitudes which shaped their perceptions of King Philip's War and would greatly influence their actions. Historically, religious people saw virtually every event as, in one way or another, linked to otherworldly forces, which both sides would attempt to sway in their favor to help deliver them victory. As a general rule, ritual behavior increases during times of uncertainty, and this is often accompanied by supernatural experiences. Manifestations of spirits, dark magic, prophecies, and fervent supplications to gods permeate this chapter of history. What did we do wrong? Why is this happening? And how could this be a part of God's plan? These kinds of questions would haunt everyone as the cosmic order dissolved back into primordial chaos. Preconceptions about the world and one's place within it were subverted. Doubt gnawed away, and terror struck even the most faithful, amid a scene of pandemonium which could only be conveyed in mythological terms. Colonist Ben Thompson, in an effort to capture the spirit of the times, directed an artist to paint the ancient goddess of strife ruling over New England, where disorder became an order of its own.
Let a taxi be mounted on a throne, imposing her commands on everyone. One she bids flee, another stay, a third she bids betake him to his rusty sword, this to his treasure, the other to his knees. Some counsels she to fry, some to freeze. These to the garrison, those to the road. Some run empty, some to take their load. Thus, while confusion most men's hearts divide, doth their small exchequer soon decide.
It's somewhat easy for us today to look back at these notions as a kind of primitive superstition. But some of the stories you're going to hear may just give us a little pause for thought, that perhaps there is something deeper going on under the surface. Join me as we enter the otherworldly side of war, which often goes unrecognized, examining the complex interplay between spirituality, identity, and space in the midst of two cultures in collision. Death rattles into the abyss like a call, and something has taken notice. Before we begin, I just want to warn viewers that some of the information we'll be covering here may be disturbing and/or triggering. You're going to hear some accounts of extreme violence and words that reflect serious bigotry. As a truth seeker, I believe it's sometimes necessary to examine the darkest elements of humanity, and that some of the most important truths often lie in places we may not want to look. As Carl Jung said, "In filth it shall be found." Also know that even though I have my own opinions, I do my best to cover topics fairly and honestly. As someone who respects and finds value in all cultures, I want to be sensitive, but I also don't want to pander or sugarcoat. Hopefully, when it's all said and done, you'll know that my heart is in the right place. I don't cover these things for the sake of being provocative or muckraking, but for a purpose. I think it is going somewhere, and even I wasn't sure exactly where at first, but that should become more clear by the end of this series. I encourage you to reserve your judgments until the end, and that will be at the end of not this video, but part 3. With that out of the way, let's begin. Now, first of all, this is not a chronological history of the events of King Philip's War. If you're interested in knowing that, I can link to several other videos that will explain it. We will be covering some of the more pertinent events as they relate to themes of the supernatural and religion. But before we get into any of that, I'd like to begin by discussing the spiritual paradigms of the people of the 17th century living in New England, and how these traditions shaped the socio-political landscape of the war and informed its rules of engagement. As the clouds gathered on the eve of battle, colonial officials declared a mandatory period of fasting, prayer, and humiliation. Colonists were told to abstain from, quote, intolerable pride in their clothes and hair, and from visiting taverns. This anxious expiation would continue over the course of the war in what was likely an effort to deliver them from destruction. The quote, Indian scourge was interpreted as a punishment by God for English sin. It would soon become painfully evident that God was very displeased.
Righteous God hath heightened our calamity,
declared the Massachusetts government,
and given commission to the barbarous heathen to rise up against us, and to become a smart rod, seeming as if it were to cast us off, hereby speaking aloud to us, to search and try our ways, and turn again unto the Lord, from whom we have departed with a great backsliding.
In viewing the natives as an impersonal force, by this logic, there was little to be gained through diplomacy. Instead, the focus was turned towards their perceived relationship with God. Throughout the war, there was an ever-present and urgent need to atone. To make sense of their misfortune, preachers would complain of dwindling church attendance and what they deemed to be a degeneration into moral depravity. Mather, in dramatic fashion, would impress this into the public consciousness by publishing the confession of a man who had admitted to copulating with a mare, a cow, 2 goats, 5 sheep, 2 calves, and a turkey. This guy was really getting around the farm. He was promptly executed for his buggery. For the Puritans, this was a big deal, a symptom of a collective spiritual sickness that was creeping in. This image of an unholy union between man and beast was a powerful symbol which struck at the heart of the Puritan mind and its greatest fear. So one thing we need to understand is that for early colonists, the preservation of their Englishness, which to them was synonymous with civility, was paramount. In their minds, all around them were forces that threatened to undermine and erode their identity. Though they had intentionally distanced themselves from England, they nonetheless considered themselves English and wanted to retain this culture. From the moment the Pilgrims had set foot in the New World, there was a real concern that through its corrupting influence, the enlightened colonists might over time devolve into a savage state. Interestingly, as Lepore points out, the question of where the Indians originated was important in assessing this threat. If what they had told Roger Williams was true, that, quote, they have sprung and grown up in that very place, like the very trees of the wilderness, then they could rest easy. Natives then were almost like an anthropomorphization of the land itself, sort of beyond the conceptual reach of any comparison to the colonists. If, however, these people were migrants from possibly Eurasia, perhaps they had once been more, quote, cultured and were corrupted by what some feared was this sort of degenerating influence inherent in the wilderness itself. So in doing this, the Puritans were ascribing a sort of preternatural agency to the land, which changed people indiscriminately, implying that it sort of had a will or consciousness of its own. A surprisingly animistic view. No doubt the Manitou, which dwelled in the woods and swamps, were known to many Puritans, and they considered them to be demons. The dark spirit Hobbamock would strive to set his devilish designs through the souls of men. From this, the colonists, saved by a great vigilance and piety, quarantined within the precincts of the shining city on the hill, would not be immune. And so the main way to cancel out these effects of the wilderness was to tame it. Only by, quote, improving on it could they effectively cast out its demons. Land that was developed was sanctified and could be claimed. That the Native Americans did not improve the land to their standards would later be used as a justification for its seizure. So these mystical broodings colored English descriptions of Native Americans in war. They're portrayed as if part of the wilderness itself, almost to the point of lacking physical bodies of their own. And part of this stemmed, of course, from the actual experience in fighting them. Colonist David Thompson, reflecting on their mastery of camouflage, wrote,
"The trees stood like sentinels, and bullets flew. For every bush, a shelter for their crew. Every stump shot like a musketeer, and bows and arrows every tree did bear."
In no place was this blurring of distinctions between man and nature more striking than in the swamp. To the colonists' eyes, Indians were entirely invisible in swamps, disembodied, indistinguishable from the vegetation around them. Writes Lepore, swamps were, quote, so full of bushes and trees that a parcel of Indians may be within length of a pike of a man, and yet he cannot discover them. In the chaos of the swamps, the English might even mistakenly shoot one another. As a result, English soldiers were quite appropriately terrified of the swamps. Daniel Henchman and his forces were not willing to run into the mire after them, being taught by late experience how dangerous it is to fight in such dismal woods.
When their eyes were muffled with the leaves, and their arms pinioned with the thick boughs of trees, as their feet were continually shackled with the roots spreading every way in those boggy woods, it is ill fighting with a wild beast in his own den.
Colonial soldiers were often confounded by this guerrilla warfare, which almost exclusively relied on hit-and-run tactics, using woods and swamps to ambush, evade reprisals, and hide their movements. Colonial historian William Hubbard, in his accounting of the war, conceded that, quote, "Our forces as yet could never overtake them in the woods." This type of engagement was wholly unfamiliar to the English, and many would complain of the natives' total disregard for the normal rules of conduct in war that they were accustomed to, fighting in what was described as a, quote, base, cowardly, contemptible way. Instead of targeting military forts, they often attacked undefended towns. In the words of Roger Williams,
"All their war is Kamootin. They have Kamootined our houses, our cattle, and our heads."
And yet, for all their moral posturing, their ability or willingness to uphold their own ideals of just warfare would prove to be a tenuous proposition. War can cause even those with good or righteous intentions to do evil things. This was in fact the real corrupting influence, not the wilderness itself as the Puritans believed. It was simply the outlet through which the darker aspects of human nature could express themselves, sort of unfettered in the absence of the social constraints of a more ordered, established society.
Christians in this land have become too like unto the Indians.
Increase Mather would later write,
And then we need not wonder if the Lord hath afflicted us by them.
As Lepore writes, quote, "The Wampanoags, Narragansetts, Nipmucks, as well as the Pocumtucks and Abenakis, attacked dozens of English towns, burning as many houses and killing as many inhabitants as they could. And the English, with occasional help from Mohegan, Pequot, Mohawk, and Christian Indians, burned wigwams, killed women and children, and sold prisoners into slavery. Both sides practiced torture and mutilation of the dead." If the Puritans should offend God too greatly, even the most superb martial prowess would be in vain. The war itself was to them an evaluation and trial being conducted by him, using the natives as his instrument of justice. And so religious devotion and repentance were the only real means of action which ultimately mattered. Victory in war was synonymous with spiritual salvation and could not be achieved without it. Just as the colonists turned to spirituality in time of war, so too did their native adversaries. Powwows likely had a significant role in galvanizing their people toward battle. In this sense, they functioned similarly to colonial priests as advocacy leaders with public influence. Roger Williams translated the word powwow as meaning wise speaker, stating that they would, quote, make solemn speeches and orations or lectures to them concerning religion, peace, or war and all things. Their voices alone were said to have an air of preternatural power. It was said that they could project considerably louder and over greater distances than the average person. Still more methods were used to steer the tide of war in more subtle ways than guns and swords. Whereas Puritans took the passive approach of prayer and supplication, natives of the region expanded beyond this, attempting to directly tap into and manipulate supernatural forces. Historian Neil Salisbury explains that for Algonquins, quote, warfare was a contest in which one sought to intimidate and scatter one's enemies through a combination of physical and supernatural weapons. One practice which blended both of these was beheading. Narragansetts believed that the soul resided in the head, and that separating it from the body caused the soul to become earthbound, preventing its transit into the afterlife. In some cases, English bodies were exhumed and their heads were removed for this purpose. To them, this ensured eternal victory in both this world and the next. Many tribes of the region were also known to practice torture on their captured enemies. There was also a spiritual belief behind this. To endure torture before execution was a rite of passage. The victim was challenged to remain unfazed during the process, and in doing so was conferred with spiritual honor. To inflict this on the English could have been another way to tarnish their soul. Others have argued that this was actually to give them a chance to regain their honor if they had tried to flee from combat. So moving to the purely magical side, the powwows would attempt to wield their magic against their foes. Anthropologist William S. Simmons writes, quote, 17th century shamans deliberately attempted to bewitch personal enemies and political rivals on their own behalf as well as on behalf of patrons. Reports of powwows' workings reveal a variety of practices and abilities which inspired both awe and dread. One example is the use of weather magic. In August of 1675, a powerful storm blew down several English houses, and afterward colonist Nathaniel Saltonstall was informed by the enemy that their powwows had caused it, claiming that for every tree blown over, an Englishman would die. An even stranger form of this alleged environmental manipulation was documented by Roger Williams, who, in a letter to Governor Winthrop, reported,
The Pequots hear of your preparations, and comfort themselves in this, that a witch amongst them will sink the pinnaces by diving under water and making holes, as also they shall now enrich themselves with your store of guns.
The two main methods of offensive sorcery were what's referred to as magical intrusion and something called dream soul capture. For magical intrusion, a physical object was prepared and projected into the target's body by the aid of a servitor spirit. Missionary Thomas Mayhew wrote,
"The powwows counted their imps among their preservers, had them treasured up inside their bodies, which they brought forth to hurt their enemies."
Mayhew also stated that the spirit would change into, quote,
"the real body of a serpent, which comes directly towards a man in the house or in the field, looming or having a shadow about him, like a man, and do shoot a bone, as they say, into the Indian's body, which sometimes killeth him."
This seems somewhat reminiscent of the European belief in elf-shot. Aside from the Manitou spirit helpers, earthbound human spirits could also be directed to do the practitioner's bidding. In one documented case, a woman who had fallen ill called for a powwow to heal her. The powwow's diagnosis was that she was being afflicted by the soul of a dead Englishman, which had actually been sent by another powwow to harm her. He captured this English ghost in a deerskin, and she quickly recovered. The ritual decapitations we mentioned earlier could have also been used for this type of necromancy. Moving on to the practice of dream soul capture, this was done by, quote,
"seizing something of the spirit of such they intended to torment or kill while it wandered in their sleep. This they kept being in the form of a fly, closely imprisoned, and according as they dealt with this, so it fared with the body of the person it belonged to."
We could maybe compare this to the West African voodoo doll concept, a type of sympathetic magic. In one instance, Wampanoag warriors taunted the English by saying that their god was, quote, all on one fly, implying that he was basically inferior to the powwows and their Manitou. As people on both sides of the war were deeply spiritual, this period was not just a contest of military but also of religious strength. Perceived spiritual dominance over the enemy was both a source of morale and a tool of psychological warfare. A colonial survivor of the attack on the town of Sudbury gave an account that
An elderly Englishman, endeavoring to escape by running into a swamp, was overtaken by an Indian, and being destitute of weapons to defend himself, the Indian insulted over him with that blasphemous expression,
"Come, Lord Jesus, save this poor Englishman, if thou canst, whom I am now about to kill."
This was, of course, shocking to the Puritans and thus had its intended effect, later circulating in print both in America and England. While there is little documentation on this kind of sorcery having an impact on the war, we do have an interesting statement given by Cotton Mather that by sacrificing one of the colonists' dogs to, quote, the devil, natives were able to actually stop them from barking, and this made it much harder for colonial soldiers to detect and track their war parties. Mather testifies that this was indeed the case for several months. There are also later records of powwows who had a similar strange effect on the behavior of dogs. Of all the magical tools that were being used, it was divination that certainly had the biggest impact on the war. Signs and omens communicated occult information, predicting the likelihood of certain outcomes. Careful attention to auguries informed many important decisions, sometimes causing war parties to act in unexpected ways, which seemed irrational to the English observer. As Symonds writes, quote, "If the Indians had written their history of King Philip's War, they might have emphasized the importance of shamanistic divination in the formulation of strategy. For example, On the morning of May 8, 1676, a war party of more than 300 Indians appeared in the rain-soaked meadows around the town of Bridgewater, Massachusetts. While they were setting fire to several buildings, a sudden thunderstorm broke out, and they withdrew without killing any of the 26 male defenders. According to a legend told in the area not long after King Philip's War, the warriors, quote, had a powwow when the devil appeared in the shape of a bear, walking on its 2 hind feet. If the appearance had been a deer, the Indians said, quote, they would have destroyed the whole town and all the English. Because the vision was that of a bear, they, quote, all followed him and drew off. Tispiquin, the warrior sachem who was also a great shaman, led his party and presumably divined the inauspiciousness of the day, despite his advantage in numbers. It's also interesting to note here that this manifestation actually occurred on the borders of the Hockomock Swamp, the center of the Bridgewater Triangle. When it was not being dictated by the spirits, the warrior nieces formulated battle strategies. These were men who, early colonist Edward Winslow tells us, were exceptional warriors, known for their, quote, courage and boldness, by reason whereof one of them will chase almost 100 men. But these individuals, too, often used their connection to the spirit world to guide and or aid them. Salisbury writes, quote, the sachems here surrounded themselves with an elite corps of counselors, called nieces by the Pokanoket, chosen because of their ability to visualize or incorporate the deity Hobbamock, and hence to utilize his powers for the good of the group. Winslow also mentions a third class of magical warrior whose title was unknown to him. He states that, quote, of these they have few, but esteem highly of them, and think that no weapon can kill them. In a way, we could maybe compare them to the Norse berserkers, who also had physical immunities and enhanced abilities which intimidated their opponents. Both also had an affinity with animal spirits. I wasn't able to find any accounts of the nieces going into a berserker-like frenzy before battle, but it wouldn't surprise me if they used at least some kind of trance state. William Wood describes a ceremony in which the powwow, quote, proceeds in his invocations, sometimes roaring like a bear, other times groaning like a dying horse, foaming at the mouth like a chased boar, smiting his naked breasts and thighs with such violence as if he were mad. Thus he will continue, sometimes half a day, spending his lungs, sweating out his fat, and tormenting his body in this diabolical worship. Among the tribes of southeastern New England, the roles of magical practitioner and political leader were distinct and rarely overlapped. Those few who held the office of both sachem and powwow were considered extremely powerful and, quote, greatly dreaded. Tispiquin was the exception, whom they called the Black Sachem, one of the preeminent military leaders of the war. Colonist William Wood stated that Tispiquin was said to have the power to, quote, make the water burn, the rocks move, the trees dance, and metamorphose himself into a flaming man. In winter, when there is no green leaves to be got, he will burn an old one to ashes, and putting those into the water to produce a new green leaf, and make of a dead snake's skin a living snake. It was also believed that no bullet could enter him. But despite this, as we saw earlier in the attack on Bridgewater, even he would not take an omen lightly.
a true but brief account of our losses sustained since this cruel and mischievous war began, take as follows. In Narragansett, not one house left standing. At Warwick, but one. At Providence, not above 3. At Patuxet, none left. Very few at Seconic. At Swansea, 2 at most. Marlborough, wholly laid in ashes, except 2 or 3 houses. Grantham and Nashaway, all ruined, but 1 house or 2. Many houses burnt at Springfield, Situate, Lancaster, Brookfield, and Northampton. The greatest part of Rehoboth and Taunton destroyed. Great spoil at Hatley, Hatfield, and Chelmsford. Deerfield, Holy, and Westfield, much ruined. At Sudbury, many houses burnt, and some at Hingham, Weymouth, and Braintree. Besides particular farms and plantations, a great number, not to be reckoned up, wholly laid waste, or much damnified.
In this snapshot of the ruination of New England, given by colonist Nathaniel Saltonstall, we gain an insight into not only the Puritan mind, but that of Western civilization collectively as it moves into the era of industrialization. Curiously, Saltonstall gives us an accounting of the losses of property before mentioning any loss of human life. This seems to indicate, according to Lepore, that property for the colonists constituted the central crisis of the war. As she explains in The Advent of Capitalism, quote, property became the defining character of social relations, the defining character even of an individual's identity. If one were to lose their property and possessions, in a sense, they lost their sense of self and their value as a human being. Of course, the colonists had practical reasons to be disheartened. Without their property and possessions, New England was a difficult place to survive, and these were people's livelihoods and things they had worked their whole lives for. But there was also a deeper psychological undercurrent at play. We see in some cases where people were so attached that it would cost them their lives. Of course, their reluctance to flee is understandable on a practical level. In some cases, people were cut down as they exited their homes. But even when there was an opportunity to escape, some would choose to stay inside until the flames killed them. The issue of property is also an issue of sacred space. In Anglican belief, it was the will of God to improve upon the wilderness through horticulture and building development, whereby it became a part of the cosmos. Going back to the principles outlined by Eliade, the boundary of this developed land symbolically separates cosmic order from chaos. As Eliade writes, quote, everything outside it is no longer a cosmos, but a sort of, quote, other world, a foreign, chaotic space, peopled by ghosts and demons. The colonies of New England, to me, are one of the best examples of this concept at play. In this worldview, when land is stripped of its improvements, it essentially returns to a primordial, undistinguished state along with its owner. Identity or being is truly lost. This obsession with separation from chaos is even reflected in how the colonists waged war. Rather than pursuing the enemy when they fled a location, colonial troops would opt to hold that territory and build a fort there, which, as Officer Benjamin Church complained, had no real benefit, as Philip and his men were constantly on the move. Thinking they were depriving them of key positions, in reality it was meaningless. both groups were largely unwilling or unable to meet on each other's terms. This is an example where the cultural divide does impact how things play out. After detailing the loss of property, Saltonstall continues by tallying the dead.
It is generally thought that of the English there hath been lost, in all, men, women, and children, above 800 since the war began, of whom many have been destroyed with exquisite torments and most inhumane barbarities, the heathen rarely giving quarter to those they take, either cutting off the head, ripping open the belly, or sculping the head and skin of hair and hanging them up as trophies, wearing men's fingers as bracelets about their necks, and strips of their skin which they dress for belts. Nor have our cattle escaped the cruelty of these worse than brute and savage beasts, for what cattle they took, they seldom killed outright, or if they did, would eat but little of the flesh, but rather cut their bellies, and letting them go several days, trailing their guts after them, putting out their eyes, or cutting off one leg.
In towns like Rehoboth, the western tip of the Bridgewater Triangle, the lines between chaos and order ceased to exist. Native warriors strut freely through the town square, scorched earth, burning buildings and breaking millstones as they went. Colonist Ben Kingsley stated, quote, "Had not the Lord restrained them, they would have not left one alive to have told of our woeful day. It took all of 3 days to bury the dead." A day before this attack, the only defense in the area, a group of 80 soldiers led by Captain Pierce, had been completely annihilated by close to 1,000 Nipmuc and Narragansetts, led by the great sachem Canonchet. Pierce, while on patrol, had suspected that they were near and sent a messenger to Providence for reinforcements, but decided to put off sending the message until church service had ended, by which time it was too late. Completely surrounded, the company, which included several praying Indians from Cape Cod, nonetheless stood their ground and fought to the last. Word of the praying Indians' bravery and loyalty would spread and help to undo some of the prejudice towards, quote, friendly Indians which had been growing. But despite their efforts, nearly all the troops were killed in one of the worst colonial defeats of the war. Only 10 Englishmen were captured, 9 of which were taken to Cumberland, Rhode Island, and tortured to death. Colonial troops later buried them at a site and built stone cairns as a memorial, a place now known as Nine Men's Misery. Under the threat of attacks which could come at any time and any place, the colonial cosmos had been breached. The howling wilderness was now threatening to swallow them whole. As the pandemonium reached its crescendo, colonial authorities even proposed building a wall of stone from the Charles River all the way to Massachusetts Bay, quote, by which means that whole tract would be environed for the security and safety under God of the people, their houses, goods, and cartel from the rage and fury of the enemy. Eventually, they abandoned this idea, realizing that it would cut the colonies off from one another. So the colonists had to face this new reality, in which there was no guarantee of security. As Lepore writes, quote, "The war, it seemed, redefined the physical landscape. No longer did fences mark the boundaries of safety, no longer town limits, but the walls of houses and the skin of bodies." This breakdown of the symbolic cosmos not only threatened physical but also spiritual life. As Eliade explained, that for religious man, the boundary between cosmos and chaos is believed to be ordained by deity. The colonists were no exception to this. To them, it was the will of God that had allowed them to set up this colony to begin with, and their new society in the New World was part of his plan. And so part and parcel of this is that within this cosmos, it was expected that they would be granted some form of divine protection. And some colonists would cling to this idea at their peril. A man in Rehoboth who had refused to leave his home believed that if he continued to read the Bible, he would be protected, and he was found shot to death, still clutching the Bible in his hand. The prospect of losing the colonies undermined their most fundamental soteriological assumptions, a sign that God was dissatisfied with his people, and at worst, that he had revoked the cosmic privilege. Beyond anything else they could lose, including their lives, to be estranged from God, to lose his favor, was the worst fate that could be imagined. Many times they would express their preference to die rather than being cast out of their homes and forced to live among and like the quote, godless heathen. But despite the reproach of ministers like Mather, who asked, quote,
"Why should we suppose that God is not offended with us when his displeasure is written in such visible and bloody characters?"
Many colonists struggled to understand why.
The burden that I bear night and day,
Bemoaned colonist John Kingsley.
to see the blessed and loving God thus angry, and we have not a prophet to tell us how long, and to say this or these are New England's sin.
Whatever was invoking his wrath, atonement rites were evidently not enough to assuage it, as just after one of these sessions, the colonists were dealt one of the heaviest blows they would take. On September 18th, 1675, a company of soldiers escorting evacuees from the town of Deerfield stopped at the banks of a river, and placing their muskets on the ground to forage for grapes, they were suddenly ambushed by a group of Pocumtuck warriors. 57 colonists were slain in a massacre so bloody that it was said the waters were stained red. The river was dubbed afterward as Bloody Brook.
The heathen were wonderfully animated,
Increased Mather mused.
some of them triumphing and saying that so great a slaughter was never known, and indeed in their wars with one another the like hath rarely been heard of.
The Bloody Brook massacre was, according to William Hubbard, quote, the most fatal day and the saddest that ever befell New England. In the medical jargon of the time, wounds where the skin had been sliced open were referred to as lips, and while the colonists believed that God spoke through them, he voiced his displeasure in strange and silent tongues which they could not comprehend. Ironically, in this manic preoccupation with the nature of God's will, they seem to have failed to consider that perhaps it was not he who was angry. Native Americans, while different from the colonists, had just as strong a cosmic and societal order of their own. Their world, despite the English inability or unwillingness to recognize it, was collapsing in the wake of colonial expansion. Still, colonists insisted that they had done no wrong. They may not have intended to, and to some extent they probably believed it. But from the documentation we have, it's clear that English presence was increasingly detrimental to native life. Their voice, however, went largely unheard and or ignored, and moreover undocumented, as most Native Americans could not write. And despite all these societal upheaval, there was one thing over which the English retained control, and that was the printing press. If the powwows used magic to shape reality, the colonists used writing, portraying themselves as justified and the natives as unreasonable. This is, of course, not a unique phenomenon, as any warring culture, in order to wage war effectively, needs to do this. The framing of war turns an act which is under normal circumstances morally offensive into something that is socially acceptable. In this sense, ritual and language both work by selecting certain ideas and boxing out others, contextualizing something to control or modify our experience of it. In both forms, individual elements take on new meaning by certain associations and combinations with others. As anthropologist Mary Douglas writes, ritual, quote, changes perception because it changes these selective principles. This is true of language. Once words have been framed, the thought is changed and limited by the very words selected. So the speech has created something, a thought which might not have been the same. Psychoanalyst Marion Milner explains that this, quote, makes possible the creative illusion called transference. This is where certain attitudes about one thing are projected onto something else. So the framing of something like war, projecting religious ideas onto it, influences how we view another group and sways our actions toward them. How we deal with sacred space, the process of separating certain things from others, the sacred from the profane, and then linking together similar elements within these categories in the physical landscape also extends in this way into the mental landscape. And today we still engage in this type of patterning behavior, with or without religion. The only difference is, as Douglas states, where in primitive cultures, quote, it works with more total comprehensiveness. With the moderns, it applies to disjointed, separate areas of existence. I don't want to get too far into the secular side of the war, but it is important that we cover some of it to contextualize the subject properly and really understand why the war happened to begin with. We have to do some framing of our own. This projection and depersonalization that was being propagated through narratives of the war became all the more dangerous in the communication breakdown between the two sides. When truth is not spoken, lies and fallacies fill the silence. With regard to native grievances, as Lepore points out, quote, the colonists rarely put the question to Indians themselves, and when on occasion colonial authorities did interrogate Indians about their reasons for fighting, full and candid answers were hardly forthcoming. Captured or surrendered Indian men and women were not likely to court execution by speaking defiantly. When Peter Aschewonks presented himself to the Plymouth Council to make peace with the English in June 1676, he was quick to declare that, quote, the English never did us any hurt or wrong to this day. If they had, he assured examiners, we would speak of it. Although his questioners urged him to, quote, speak freely without fear, it seems unlikely that Peter would have wanted to do so, despite his assurances to the contrary. Philip himself was not afraid to speak his mind. Weeks before the war began, he had met with Rhode Island Deputy Governor John Easton, who had initially tried to put him off, saying, quote, we knew what their complaints would be. When they finally gave him a hearing, he offered a long list of complaints, including the taking of land, interference with agriculture, also attempting to convert natives to Christianity, as well as injustice of the court system, whereby if, quote, 20 of their honest Indians testified that an Englishman had done them wrong, it was nothing. But if one of their worst Indians testified against another Indian or their king when it pleased the English, that was sufficient. And yet, as outspoken as he was, it appears that he did not threaten them with war. When the violence broke out, colonists complained that he, quote, drew his report in blood rather than ink. It seems that he was no longer interested in peaceful settlement. However, in one instance, a group of Quakers did meet with him and claimed that he was open to the idea, but since they had no authority to arbitrate, it was never pursued. It's possible that this apparent contradiction may have had something to do with him wanting to maintain his image as a strong, decisive leader. This is one of the many examples in history where politics and posturing, these bureaucracies built up around the people, only made things worse. One of the only primary source statements that we have given by natives themselves is a note that was nailed to a tree on the outskirts of the burning town of Medfield. It read, quote, "Thou English hath provoked us to anger and wrath, and we care not, though we have war with you these 21 years. We have nothing but our lives to lose. But thou hast many fair houses, cattle, and much good things." This brief but pithy statement reveals something which many colonists had up until that point not fully considered, that the tribes uniting under Philip were responding to transgressions against them. When Roger Williams had attempted to negotiate with the Narragansetts, they informed him that, quote, "You have driven us out of our country and then pursued us to our great misery, and we are forced to live upon you." English husbandry and development in the wake of rapid population growth had significantly damaged the natural resources which natives relied on. This is why they hated and killed livestock, because they were overgrazing on native land, even eating their corn. This, along with population growth, they were basically being forced to move further and further away, or convert to Christianity and move to praying towns, which had limited opportunity, mainly relying on English subsistence practices. There were also severe economic pressures that came with the devaluation of wampum. To stay afloat and secure English goods on which they were now very dependent, they had to resort to selling off land and the fur trade, which was now collapsing from overhunting. And the English basically turned a blind eye to this and eagerly bought up any land that they could, even if it violated the treaties which had been signed by the previous generation. It was said that the children of the Pilgrims, having been born in America, had, quote, grown from a strange vine. They had strayed from the more noble path of their forefathers, tempted and corrupted by greed. These influences, then pressuring to convert to Christianity, was also destabilizing the social order. As people moved into praying towns, they were no longer beholden to the tribe. This split was also weakening their cultural cohesion, causing psychological stress, as worsening conditions were being attributed to the forlorn Manitou. The gods were angry that people were departing from the traditional ways. I should point out that not all people converted because they were pressured to do so. There were some groups that did accept it on their own terms by choice, the main example being the Mashpees on Cape Cod, and their community became a safe haven for refugees from other tribes. All of this social degradation is well understood by historians today, but at the time it was by and large lost on the colonists. Of all the sins they could conceive which might have offended God, the mistreatment of Native Americans was seldom counted among them, with the main exception being their failure to convert more of them to Christianity. Because the colonists saw themselves as more or less good neighbors, native assaults were interpreted as being motivated by a sort of sheer delight in cruelty, painting them as these demonic caricatures. Throughout history, we see how religious zealotry, or really any tribalism, can engender a warped, reductive view of reality. Those who are with the group are all good, and those who are against are all evil. We're still susceptible to this kind of thinking today, and part of my motivation to cover topics like this is to push back against it. By the time we're done here, nobody is going to come out of this looking completely innocent. And that's just kind of how the world works. Groups are made up of individuals, and among any of them, there are good and bad actors, and many that waver between the two. We all struggle with overcoming our darkness. It's part of the human condition. I think sometimes it's hard for us to keep this in mind when we think about people of the past, and especially historical figures, as they sort of become these archetypes. History is written in stone, and it's almost like for us subconsciously, its people also become stone in a way, instead of the living, dynamic beings that they were. And if we fail to acknowledge the complexity of these things, it reflects a fundamentally flawed worldview. That's not to say we can't distinguish between right and wrong, good or bad. As Ernest Hemingway said, never think that war, no matter how necessary, nor how justified, is not a crime. But the way in which these things manifest in the world is never clear-cut. My goal in bringing all of this up is not to point fingers or make moral judgments. It's to understand how these horrible things could transpire. So as flawed as these views of the colonists were, we should have some empathy. This grand guignol, terroristic sort of violence Philip's men inflicted on them was no doubt traumatizing and difficult to come to terms with. As Lepore writes, quote, "Such terrifying ravages strained even the most eloquent colonists' powers of description." But what was construed by the colonists as mindless savagery and evil was actually a strategic calculation. It was meant to demoralize them, in the hope that the colonists would ultimately leave their world entirely. Certainly the natives who participated in the war understood that if they failed, their lives would be forfeit, which speaks to their total desperation. It was a case of the ends justify the means. The powwows would push the idea that such a war was their only hope of preserving their way of life and surviving as a people, and surely many others felt the same. Recognizing English attachment to property as a sort of Achilles heel, they would seek to desecrate the very foundations of their settlements, turning them into what colonist Philip Walker described as, quote, "a burdensome and menstruous cloth, that having fouled, they might now cast out of the land." They understood the nature of the English cosmic order and used it against them. Their assaults can be viewed as a sort of symbolic communication, what anthropologists refer to as ritual cruelty. In one example of this, as a group of warriors buried English captives alive, mused,
"You English, since you have come into this country, have grown exceedingly above the ground. Let us now see how you will grow when planted into the ground."
What might seem as an ill-humored taunt was actually a philosophical statement. All of this was a condemnation of English culture itself, which was in some ways antithetical to their way of life. Going further, perhaps introducing chaos into English society was also viewed on a metaphysical level. As anthropologist Mary Douglas states, ritual, quote, "recognizes the potency of disorder." In these ritualistic acts of cruelty, writes Lepore, the Indians disordered English society, or taken as another way, Algonquins sought to restore their world to a balance, to recover it from the chaos into which it had been falling ever since the English first arrived. As the English cosmos grew in order, their cosmos waned into chaos. Reverse this inverse relationship, and perhaps the resulting transference of energy could restore their order. One form of magical practice is polarity magic, which uses opposing forces to achieve a desired effect. As medieval alchemist Paracelsus wrote, quote, "Nature is a harmonious unity of opposing forces, each necessary for the balance and perpetuation of life." So by altering one polarity of a principle, its opposite polarity is affected in proportion. In human group dynamics, it was often in, quote, primitive cultures believed to cause a spiritual imbalance, which required a corrective response. Scholar Levi Bruhl wrote that ancient man subscribed to the law of Talion, which holds, quote, to the necessity of counteraction equal to and like the action. Because he has suffered an attack, received a wound, undergone a wrong, he feels exposed to an evil influence. A threat of misfortune hangs over him. To reassure himself, to regain calm and security, the evil influence thus released must be stopped. This result will not be obtained unless the act from which he suffers is annulled by a similar act in the opposite direction. But as violence broke out over New England, the cultivation of chaos would only bring about more of the same. It's often said in the occult that curses have a way of coming back to the sender. It would not take long for the spirit of vengeance to take hold of the pious Puritans. Though they claimed to be moved by righteousness, their actions would indicate otherwise. And no doubt it became a source of psychological turmoil for conservative Puritans who worried they were becoming savage. In the Protestant ethos, no amount of prayer or penance could spare someone from the wages of sin. All the responsibility was placed on the individual. Impure actions, even thoughts alone, were corruptions of the soul, and yet they could not be rooted out. In this constrained psychic environment, under the pressures of war, the negative impulse of the shadow thrives. This irreconcilable paradox would be resolved in blood. The contradiction between external behavior and secret emotions is a frequent source of anxiety and of expected misfortune, writes Mary Douglas. These pollutions, which lurk between the visible act and the invisible thought, are like witchcraft. They are dangers from the crevices of the structure, and like witchcraft, their inherent power to harm does not depend either on external action or any deliberate intention. They are dangerous unto themselves.